Really excited today. We're going to do a bit of an unpack around AI, where the state of the market is, and then also actually sort of literacy. So basically, what you need to know to be able to get the most out of these tools. And in particular, a lot of that is around prompting. So I'll jump in. Just as a high level, I'm going to start by setting the scene in AI. So a little bit around technology, where things have got to, the release of ChatGPT, and then where we are today in 2026. I'll then talk a bit more about specifically in legal why AI literacy matters, how it can impact your roles and help you to get more done. We'll share literally day-to-day prompting tips. So what we do a lot of is working with power users to understand how they prompt AI to get great outputs. It's not always that easy. So the way you're using the AI tool actually can really impact the quality of outputs you're getting. So I'm going to dive into that. We'll also talk a bit about how super users and really top teams are managing the risks in AI. And then towards the end, we're just going to talk a little bit about where this is going in the coming years, because I think that's really interesting for everyone. And throughout, I'll pause a couple of times for questions. Please do also ask questions as we go. Hannah will be monitoring the chat. So if you ask questions, she will bring them forward to me. And also, if you ask a question, we don't have time to get to it today because we only have an hour session, we will make sure to follow up with you separately just to make sure to answer that as well. And it's great to see everyone introducing themselves in the chat as well. Heard such great things about the Counsel World community. So we're really delighted to have you all here today. So kicking off, if we just were to look back at technology over the last few hundred years, there are some quite interesting patterns. And I think today is a particularly interesting time to be looking at technology. So, from the things like the invention of the printing press and industrial revolution, the reason I've got those on the slide is a lot of people actually, particularly in the AI community, think that the changes from the introduction of AI are a little more similar to the industrial revolution or the printing press than they are to the invention of, say, the personal computer, the internet, or the mobile age. So, in particular, here, what I would call out is during this period, you were generally seeing productivity growth year on year in the economy, measured by like growth in GDP, was around 2 to 3% annually. Um, oh, I can see is there duplicated audio? I'll see if there's any. I'll pause in case there is. Feel free to stop me. So the productivity growth during this period, prior to what I would say is modern technology, was around 3% year on year. What we're now seeing is actually during this period, it was more like 1% year on year. So actually, the rate of new ability for people to do things, even with the launch of the personal computer, the internet, and mobile, which have changed all of our lives, look to be still relatively slow rate of progress compared to things like the Industrial Revolution. It looks like AI is probably more similar to the Industrial Revolution. What that will mean is you're probably going to see much larger changes in what you can do on a day-to-day basis than you saw from things like the launch of the internet or from starting to use mobile phones. That means that what we're talking about today is super important and super exciting. The opportunities are massive, but also being aware of these for people who adopt these tools is extremely powerful. Um, I'll also just touch on, I don't know, for most people here today, we work on it day to day, but I'm sure most people are busy getting through all of, I was myself a lawyer. I know how much pressure there can be as an in-house lawyer. Usually there are things coming in from all around the business. They're all urgent and there's a huge amount of pressure that people are trying to get through. We spend all our time looking at AI and how it's developing. And so I wanted to share with you where we've landed today. One of the first things is that everyone will have been probably aware of the ChatGPT launch around November 2022. One of the first signs that this was an unusual level of change in technology was that if you look at the time to reach 100 million users, Netflix took 120 months, even sort of Facebook or Instagram, you're looking at 3 years for Instagram, 6 years for Facebook. ChatGPT, the time was around 2 months. So it means it's the fastest growing product that was ever released to the market to hit 100 million users. So that it's a kind of an indication of how rapidly this is being adopted. And I think many people on this call will have used ChatGPT and similar tools. The next sort of phase is you saw that there were other big competitors. So one of the famous ones was Facebook's Llama models. Those were local models and they would compete with ChatGPT. And there's another big one called Claude. There are a few different providers now, but it's interesting that relatively quickly there are choices between different AI providers providing similar services. It's been a bit of a race for a while. You'd have seen often the top three on the sort of consumer are between Claude, Gemini, and OpenAI. And there's no clear winner at the moment. So one of the things we do at Claren is we do for legal use cases, we do a ton of evaluation on the models to understand for legal which is the best. It's really hard in this current horse race to be every day logging into a different tool to understand which is the best model. We do a lot of that monitoring for our customers to make sure that they can see what the best model is and they know that that's inside Claren. The other big step I think it might be interesting to touch on is you may have seen with AI, one of the big changes is they started to explain what they were doing. So initially, AI would just give you text in, text out. Then you started to see step by step what the AI was thinking. It helps you to like understand how it came to its conclusions. We tend to see for lawyers this is really useful because actually, if it misses clause 7 that's on an indemnity, you can read through and be like, did it ever even think about it or has it just missed it? That's actually a big change and it helps you to understand what AI is thinking. The big change at the end of then 2025 was that lots of the labs have been focusing on coding. The view now in AI looks to be that all problems are basically can for the AI be made into coding problems. So if an AI is really good at coding, it will like build a whole website to help you draft a contract. What we're seeing with our tools say is that it will learn from scratch how to produce a Word document using code to help you with redlining. So that's a really big change and it's quite interesting. The last piece I'd highlight here is so historically, OpenAI was always the biggest player. What we've recently seen is that Anthropic has taken over there, and Anthropic has always focused on enterprise AI use. So what we're seeing now is initially the tools were very big with consumers, people using them for recipes, planning a holiday. And like those are great use cases. But what we're seeing is this is now shifting much more into business and people using it in a professional setting. And one of the reasons you can really know that that's the case is that actually the amount of revenue that Claude has now overtaken OpenAI. And that's because they're focusing on using it in businesses. And I think it's worth just having this context as we run through where we sit today. So the last piece on just a bit of history and context on AI is that one of the big new laws that's coming out of the AI labs is that every 4 months, the length of task AI can handle looks to be doubling. So what that means is it's not necessarily getting smarter, but you can leave it to run for a lot longer on a task. And that's an interesting concept because it means that you could expect right now, you might, when you set your AI to work, you often would leave it for about 30 seconds to do a task and then you'd have to check in. The expectation is that in about 2 years, you would leave an agent to run for an entire day of work. So maybe it will be, triaging messages, drafting contracts, responding to things for an entire day before you would step in. And by the time reach the end of 2028, it looks likely that AI would be able to do like a whole week's work without you touching it again. This is a very exciting and interesting development, but it helps frame our perspective for this because it's worth looking at it that effectively what you're going to see is the capabilities of AI are going to grow massively in the next 1 to 2 years. And so really being at the forefront of it is really helpful. And we're hoping that we'll be able to share some useful information on what we're seeing power users doing now. Um, so how does this really apply into legal? Now, one of the things we're seeing across executive teams is that fundamentally people are starting to say, actually, it's a core competency of your role to understand how to use AI. We're seeing AI is often being used in legal teams, but what we focus on really is, are you using it well? Are you getting really trustable, high quality outputs? With generally, one of the ways this shows up for in-house teams, which I think is challenging, is people be like, I want you to do more with less. We hear it so much when we talk to general counsels, is they say their board's coming to them and they're saying, you can't have more headcount, and I want you to do more documents as we grow. And people are looking at it and say, well, that is an extremely challenging proposition. And like usually the answer there looks to be like start trying to leverage AI so that you guys can focus less on the kind of day-to-day work and more on the high-value strategic items that are really important. The other thing is that it's not just like using AI badly is of course a problem. We'll help unpacking that. But towards the end of this, I'm going to talk about how you spot when it's wrong, how people are getting comfortable with things like hallucinations, doing research, security. The last bit is then obviously regulation, clients, leadership. You'll probably be seeing a ton of new contract reviews around AI tool training, AI adoption, where it can be used. It's an exciting area to dive into, and it's very dynamic. Um, so maybe more specifically now, what are lawyers actually using AI for in their day-to-day work? The number one thing that we see people is probably contract review and drafting. Contract review that tends to look like having the AI flag risks for you, do a first pass of the document. It's not to the same quality as a human, and I think it's important to emphasize that. And then it will actually go through and put in track changes and add the comments for you. And then you would do the review after that. And that's probably the biggest bucket of time saving we see across all of the lawyers we're working with. Behind that is usually drafting and from scratch. Now that can be obviously a first draft of a document from scratch off of a prompt. So you may have a precedent, or you may not. So you could go no precedent and ask for a simple, engagement letter. But you might also take a precedent of an SPA that you did a deal last year, and you'll say, okay, looking at this one, can you now, based on these two SPAs we signed last year, can you produce me an SPA for this new deal in these circumstances? And the AI would use those two to produce a new draft. It's another really big area, and it's probably one of the largest time saving areas. Legal research, I think, is a really interesting topic. We see it's very fast for orientation on unfamiliar areas. In particular, what we're seeing is if you're working in a jurisdiction that you've not worked in before, it's really good to get yourself up to speed before you go to local counsel. But I'll come on to some of the risks around legal research. It's a really important area. Things like case law, primary legislation. I expect people on the call have seen it, but you can see tools hallucinate, and I'll talk a bit about how you try and avoid that. But one of the structural elements of large language models is you can never completely have zero hallucinations. If a provider tells you there are no hallucinations, I would certainly push back, because actually that's like a structural issue with AI. We see huge reductions in the level, but the trick is you need to know when to check for the risks. The last three ones here is lots of teams used to maintain risk trackers or existing like due diligence style trackers for all of the terms you've agreed in your historic contracts. So every time you sign an NDA, you might want to know like what the term is, when it renews, whether or not there was an indemnity. Those things used to often be done by lawyers either in like a Word document or a spreadsheet. We're tending to see people now will have save it into an AI system that does that management for you. And then the last two buckets here, things like time recording. I put time recording, but it's not just that. Time recording, invoicing, admin, like even just drafting emails around the team, like some short memos. Really big area, not as big as the buckets above, but still an area people are get saving a lot of time. And the last one is things like summarization. So you might receive, 15, a pack of 15 documents for say like board approvals. And you might just want 3 lines on what each document's about before you dig in and choose what order to read them in. That's something that is not as new as some of the other areas I'm talking about here. That's one of the things that ChatGPT probably people have used early, but it still remains really helpful. If you need to put something into digestible language for your commercial team, you'll probably find running the contract through AI and asking for its output will be really helpful. So jumping in now, so obviously if lawyers are using AI for all of these particular use cases, I think it's worth explaining what do you need to do in your prompts to make sure you get really good outputs. And some of them might surprise you. So kicking off is, interestingly, AI, just like a person, can be lazy. So sometimes when you set AI off on a task, if you don't say review every single clause, you just say, take a look in this document for things that might be an issue for me. It can get lazy. It won't like read every provision. Whereas if you prompt say, make sure to hit every single provision, or I am looking for these things, like I make sure, in schedule one, I'm expecting a list of items that were going to be delivered at completion. Make sure you hit every item in schedule one. You get a much better output. Whereas if you give it a 30-page document, you say, look for risks in this, and you don't direct it to the specific place, and you don't say to hit everything, you'll often see the AI. Basically, the difference we see is actually that the users who ask very specifically for it to be thorough and hit everything, they get a higher quality output than users who give a slightly more generic prompt. So it's almost like imagining one thing that's interesting with AI is when it lands and you first use it, it doesn't know how your business works. It doesn't know that you're a diligent, high quality expert in what you're doing. And so saying, I always review every single provision to check, it will help to get the AI to give you a better output. Um, the next one is like, I touched on it in what we were talking about just there, but it's really around precision. So again, if you imagine that this is a completely new joiner to your team, one of the things you'd often see when you were delegating work to someone in the team is you'd say like, can you tell me for each point that you're analyzing and giving me a risk, tell me where in the document you actually found it, and why why, what made you think that. So it's like you would take the snippet of text from the document and you'd be like, I think this is an issue for these reasons. That's how you'll often train new lawyers. it's similar with AI, and the best tools will be able to give you citations to exactly where in the Word document or where in the PDF it's found the item. But what's interesting is it's worth asking. So on default, many of the models, if you say, tell me what the risks are in this document, it will just give you the risks and it won't show you where they were from. If you say, tell me where the risks are, and when you tell me, show me the clause it came from, it will then direct you to the clause, which makes one of the things that we'll come on to is like, you would always want to check the outputs. And if you can just click and be like, oh, I completely agree, that is what the clause says, you can have a lot more confidence in the AI outputs than if you're not asking for citations. The other bit is I mean, it's a bit of a classic. Everyone would have been trading PDFs and Word files. I tend to recommend when using AI, like for example, most AI tools now will convert PDFs into Word. That's what we do. You'll see lots of providers will do that for you. But if you get a messy PDF and you also have the Word file, I would tend to go for the Word file because the way that say we do it is if you give us a messy PDF, we will read it with it's a bit better than OCR, but the AI can pick out everything and it will produce you a new Word file from that. And that takes a bit of time. But if you start with a Word file, it can go through, it can read comments, it can understand the structure of the document, you'll get better formatting. So I would try and go for Word files where you can. Those are some tips that tend to help with verification of the AI's analysis, particularly the citations point. Um, Now, this is actually probably, I would say, maybe the most important tip that I see power users getting the most from AI, what they're doing. So it's really easy when you use AI and you see something good to start thinking, okay, I bet it can do so much more. And usually it can do so much more. But if you bucket that all into one huge prompt, the risk of it going off down a tangent you weren't expecting gradually increases. It's a bit like if you ask someone, so sometimes we'll see a prompt which says, could you read these three documents, find the risks in document A and document B, tell me why document B is better than document A, then do a French translation from my French team, write me an email, and also maybe put it into PDF and run two comparisons. If you put that into what's interesting is everything I listed in that list can be done by AI. But if you ask for them all at once, what you'll often find is like midway through, it maybe runs a comparison. This wasn't what you're expecting. And then obviously the translation pieces will go wrong. So what we see from real power users is that they will do it in like a stepwise manner. So you start off by being like, okay, show me the risks in this document and document A and document B. You take a look at those. You then go, interesting. Now align document B with document A on these risks that I consider important. And you say, okay, that's great. Now, draft me an email to the counterparty that sets out those risks. And then at the final stage, you might say, now run me comparisons between those documents so that I can attach them in PDF and Word. And doing that sort of multi prompt approach is much more effective than one massive prompt. We tend to see basically staged analysis. It gives you a lot more control over the outputs. One of the things that's quite important to mention there as well is we would often see that the staged analysis approach is in effect people start sort of saving down and knowing what's going to work well and then they can layer it together. So if you've got to a point where you know that on your risk prompt it always works and then it always does the redlining correctly, you might layer those together, see if you still get exactly the output you want, but you sort of build up from small prompts into larger prompts rather than the other way around. So as you're using AI, I'd really recommend that approach. Start with smaller pieces and build up into bigger pieces. Um, this is quite a funny one. We see it less from lawyers and more from sales teams that are using the AI. We will see a lot of teams we're working with. The sales team will have the opportunity, say, to do a first pass on an NDA, and they will have the AI give them a sense of where the risks are. If everything comes back green, they may be able to proceed. If anything comes back with an orange or a red flag risk, it goes to legal. What's really interesting is the prompting is very important here. So you should always ask for what should we do? Or should we accept, reject, or negotiate these points? Sometimes I've seen people put in a contract and go, I really, really want to sign this. I think it's a good contract. Can you just tell me that that's okay and let me know if there are any risks? And by leading in your prompt by saying like, I think this contract's great. I really want to sign it as is. You bias the AI towards your view. So the better users of AI on the legal side will be saying, what is market and not market in this agreement? Where do the risks sit for my business? What I consider a material risk is something that is of over, say, $30,000 of liability for the business, or or say long-term obligations on our business, for example. So I'd be aware of encouraging sycophantic responses. It's worth mentioning as well that a lot of what we do as a provider is we spend a lot of time trying to tweak the model. So you may have seen in particular something like ChatGPT can be very sycophantic. So you'll say, if you say, "Oh, what's this contract like?" "Oh, it's the best contract I've ever seen," and and whereas we try to get a much more objective standpoint, so you're getting higher quality outputs. So it's worth testing across providers. You'll see different qualities of output based on how the model has been trained. And in particular, legal specific tools, most of them will default towards having a more unbiased view and not and really not in, we sometimes try and have the AI be aware that people may direct it in a way and therefore to push back. It's interesting. The sign when an AI pushes back is often actually that's a well-trained AI because it's helping you to understand where the risks are. So yeah, we sort of touched on this a little bit before, but one thing that we see is really, really helpful is to tell the AI before you get the output what you want to see. So if you like to send an issues list to your counterparty that has clause reference, clause, issue, response, put that into the prompt saying like it will be a table with 4 columns and those are each the points. And then you might say in your prompt, hit every single point and give me the table. It's really interesting because that will give you'd be amazed at the quality of output you get from that versus asking something similar that doesn't ask for the table. Same thing with if you always report on dates in a particular format, you can say up front when you're pulling out all the dates from this agreement, give them this format. Same thing with defined terms, or even like risks is another really good area here. So often you might say, for us, low risks would mean that it's like of a particular monetary value. That's a good way to do it. So that's usually what I'd expect to see is specifying in your prompt what you want in the output. Some of these points, so like things like high, medium, low risk, we'll often see actually legal teams configure that in the tool on like an org-wide basis. So you decide what your materiality threshold is, you save it into the memories of the tool, and then going forward for every review, it will know what you consider high, medium, and low risk, and you don't have to prompt it every time. The other thing that you might see there is really good prompts. So say you make an issues list every time you receive a large commercial contract, you might have a save prompt that says, "This is a commercial contract review. We always go back with a table of this format." And you come into what we call a prompt library. And basically it means it's just a save list of prompts. You hit that and it will immediately give the output. So this is a tip for the first time. Once you've started getting some good results, you can just save those prompts and use them again later. One of the things that's particularly exciting for teams when they adopt it across a team with AI is often you get like a power user who's really, really good at prompting. That person can then save their prompt down and share it around the team. So you get that sort of ability of knowledge sharing around the team. So everyone starts getting consistent, better outputs, and not everyone has to spend their time saying that they want a table in all the outputs. Um, this is an interesting one. Is obviously as you're adopting AI, you want it to get more specific to your business over time and start to understand better, what approaches you take. Because we've seen some businesses that, would never accept uncapped indemnities, or that seems to be standard across the board. But on liability caps, it varies a lot. Many teams are doing an approach where contracts up to 20,000, they will do a light review. Over 50,000, they look at the indemnity caps, liability caps in one manner. And maybe for a $200,000 contract, we're often seeing people have a staggered approach. So for a $500,000 contract, what you'll accept on liability is usually a lot more substantial than for like an unpaid pilot. What's interesting is you can save that into the system so that when you're doing a supplier contract review and it looks at the liability caps, it knows that for your organization, this is where you start to go on those positions. I would say the other thing is like preferences and style here. We have a lot of teams that will configure to say we always use US English or we always use British English for spelling. Or whenever I do define terms, I put them in, say, curly brackets versus square brackets. So the different teams are taking different approaches. Saving that into the AI is a massive unlock because what effectively happens is you start to get every time you use it, the output is much closer to what you're expecting. And you can get that organizational consistency. Interestingly, we work with quite a lot of fractional general counsels. I don't know if we have those on the team. We always work with in-house teams, so you guys know. But we also have fractional general counsels, and we'll often see as well there is a fractional general counsel with the tool might even start saving different approaches for different clients as well. So you can have instances where you say, well, this client, they always really care about the data liability provisions, whereas for this client, it's always like HIPAA regulation because they're in a regulated space. And so you can start to, if you're working across multiple entities as well. So we have some businesses we work with where they're regulated in one country and not in another. What they'll do is they'll set up a different set of a memory in their French subsidiary versus their US subsidiary. And then the AI starts taking a US approach and a French approach, depending on your risk tolerance. So that's often a really useful way to start across your org, getting a bit more consistency and making sure it's appropriate. Because out of the box, you won't find that the AI necessarily is most appropriate for your approach in France versus in the US. Um, I'll come back on to playbooks a bit later, but playbooks are a very interesting piece of how teams are configuring AI as well. Um, the last bit is learn from success. So I always love this tip, which is when you have a prompt or a chat, it can sometimes be a long chat you'll do and you get to a perfect output. I always love at that point to ask, what prompt should I have given at the start of this conversation to get to this output? Because the AI can read back through everything you said and be like, oh, interesting. Wow, your initial prompt was missing the point that you wanted a table, or your initial prompt was missing this. So if you just gave me this prompt next time, then I would have got straight to the output you wanted immediately. So that's quite nice. And it's basically you're letting the AI improve your own outputs. We also offer things like prompt improvers. So basically what that means is you put in a bit of a rough prompt, you hit the button, it then applies the best practices into the prompt. I think that's usually we tend to see when you're starting out can be very helpful as well. And then obviously we talked a bit about this, but save down those prompts into the library, share them around your team, and that's how you continuously improve in the outputs you're getting from AI. Yeah. So at first, and I've got an example of a bad prompt here. I will pause so everyone can maybe take a look and have a think about like what is bad about this prompt and why, based on what I've been saying. And then I'll show a good prompt, and I will also run it through Claren so you can see the sorts of outputs you tend to get. Um, I'll give it just a second so everyone can read it. Feel free if you want to ping in the chat some of the examples of reasons you think it's poor. I think that's always interesting. But I'll just give it a second while people take a look. Okay. Right. So I'm going to jump in and share some of the reasons we think this prompt isn't much good. So first off, review the supply contract. Tell me everything that's wrong with it. Now, everything that's wrong with it is, I mean, wrong, not a very objective term. There are many requests inside of this prompt, and you can see check if the liability cap is reasonable. No sense of what a reasonable liability cap would be for your business or the business context. We say review this supplier contract. We don't say which side of the supplier contract we are. Are we buying or selling? I mean, for the AI, it may not know. We tend to have it configured so that it might know what your business entity was and would read off that. But I would always recommend, say, if you're reviewing as the buyer, say that to look for the buyer. Then in the end, we say also flag anything that causes problems with our procurement policy. Interesting, like that will often work, but as a standalone prompt afterwards, and then draft a summary of risk for the business. Interestingly, on this summary of risk for the business, not very specific. Like when you say you want to send a summary of risk to the business, what do you want? Do you want like an email, a little table? Do you want just the key high risk points with commercial language? So I would say this prompt is doing too much in one prompt. And just to come on, I'll read too many tasks in one prompt. There's no sort of playbook being used here. And it's interesting that we did, if you look back actually, no, we've done the liability cap, but we haven't said to maybe look at indemnities. We haven't said to look at any specific data protection provisions. The instruction, vague, things like everything that's wrong. You imagine if you were starting with a junior person in your team who hasn't done a ton of contracting work, they're going to really struggle with that. You need to be much more specific. And also referencing previous contracts without providing them. Now, it depends. We have a data room where you could be storing your contracts in and the AI would be able to go and read them. Again, though, even if I was doing that, what I would often do is like, okay, go and find me the last supplier contracts that are similar to this SaaS provider we're looking at. Then, based on those, having seen and agreeing that those are the right ones, then I would step into these points. So, an example of a good prompt is here. So, I'll pause there. Hopefully, everyone can take a chance to read it while I'm sharing my screen. this tends to be, you'll get a lot better outputs. So there's an attached supplier contract, reviewing its standard procurement positions. Often here, I'd even refer specifically when you have a playbook configured to your playbook. We've mentioned which perspective we are. And then this is one that we'll see will really help with the quality of output you get. You say, tell me for each clause whether it's acceptable, we want to amend the language, or whether we should just reject entirely. And what's really nice is you're going to get a clause by clause, accept, amend, reject from the AI. And you can just read that and see if you agree, but it's a really useful way of doing it when we're reviewing contracts. That's often how I'll be doing it. We've then also asked for citations of the exact clause numbers. And we've also then given our key focus areas. Now, these might well often be in the playbook, but I put them in the prompt here as an example. So just to recap why this works well, there's a clear perspective. It's referred into here the procurement guidelines, but might be a playbook there. We've asked for like a structured output of accept, reject, or refine. We've defined the areas to focus on, and we've asked for citations. So if I was going to jump in, I'll do a quick example of a contract review through the tool. So you know, this is what the tool looks like when you land. It's very simple and easy to get started on. I'm just going to come in and I will batch. No, I'll do an example NDA because. So what I've done here is, again, I'm just showing an example of the prompt. When you run this, again, it specifies which party you are. Again, of course, we said check for our standard provision for inbound confidentiality agreements. One thing, absolutely, Brad, as I keep seeing the questions going through, but I will elaborate a bit more on playbooks and what that means. But you'll see here that kind of read the commercial NDA as receiver playbook that's in the system. And I will come through to talk a bit more about what a playbook is and how you set them up. But then what you'll see is I talked a bit about this earlier in the history of AI, but this is what you would call like a reasoning trace. So what that means is you'll be seeing that it's telling you everything that it's doing. And then when you want to go back through and understand why a particular point was picked up, you can actually see that directly from inside of the trace. You'll then see we've got a rather nice structured output here. So you can see it's telling me which clause it is, what the risk levels are. It's going and giving me citations to where they are. And this is actually used. So, for example, in our NDA playbook, we have certain exclusions from the definition of confidential information that we need to see. And we're seeing that some of the recommendations here are it doesn't align with our standards. The other piece, just to give an example, we talked a bit about asking for citations, which I've done here. When you then click, it will take you to exactly where that was. So when you use a generic AI tool, you often find, oh, there's an indemnity in this contract. And you think, well, what exactly does that indemnity say? Is it a problem? Can I trust what you're saying as the AI? This form of output tends to make it much easier to do the verification steps. Usually people would then go on to have the AI directly apply the red line into the document on the right-hand side. So I'll pause there actually, because I know we said we'd have a chance for some questions. I'll see if any questions have come up yet that we can take. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about the risks and how people are overcoming some of the risks with AI. But I'll pause, see if there's any questions. I don't have anything come through so far.
But I'll give it a second and see if people have some in their head.
No problem. Okay, well, we can always come back. I'll pause again in a little bit. So one of the things I always think it's important to be aware of is that AI still has limitations. We absolutely think humans need to stay in the loop. The expertise of human judgment isn't being replaced at all by AI. Complex tasks still need human judgment. AI can't be qualified to practice law, and it's not appropriate for it to do so. Hallucinations can be reduced, but you can't completely eliminate them. And I'll talk a bit about how we tend to see teams working through that. Long chats. One thing that's really interesting with AI is twofold. In a really long chat, you may have heard of the concept of a context window. That's basically the amount of text that can go into an AI before performance degrades. And the frontier AI labs are always increasing the amount of text that the AI can accept before the quality drops. But we'll talk a bit more about this, but generally a really, really long chat, you'll start to see, A, it will cost you more with your provider, and B, the accuracy will go down. We'll talk a bit about how people tend to handle that. And obviously using off-the-shelf consumer AI tools you want to be very careful about your confidentiality of client data, how your data is being stored, is your data being trained on. It's really important because once the data's out, there's no really putting the plug back in. At that point, it's into the training data. You can't necessarily get it back. You want to be really careful about where it's being stored, how it's being stored, and if you can trust the provider you're working with. Um, so this is kind of super users will see they've always found ways, given those risks, to still be able to use AI to make themselves more effective. So, what are some of those ways? So, the first one is around kind of the playbooks, and to talk about playbooks, what I would say is this is where you're customizing the AI for the pre-human review. And what that means is it tends to encode your org's preferences. And on the left, you'll often have liability, and you'd say, we would accept in a contract, one times fees for this level of contract, three times fees here, and five times fees that would escalate to the general counsel in these circumstances. Going forward, what you then start to see is that position gets picked up. And if there's an escalation, the human will jump in. Otherwise, the AI is aligning to what you have told it you want to see inside of the tool. You then don't need to re-explain every time, particularly high volume contracts. This works well on. So obviously things like NDAs, some teams are dealing with like lots of DPAs, commercial sales contracts is another one, vendor contracts. Those are the sorts of areas that playbooks work really well. It's worth mentioning we do a lot of training across a big range of contract types. So, like if you receive something really unusual you've never seen, the AI will still have had training data for that. So, playbooks tend to be for the like higher volume contracts you're seeing. For longer, complex contracts, we still see teams use the AI on those a lot, but that will then be usually a much more close combination of human experience with the AI. Um, this obviously allows non-legal colleagues to run first-pass reviews, but I would always have a lawyer review the playbook before use. So the lawyers are the people who should be the administrators setting this up, setting your standards, and then also double checking on escalation. Just to come back very briefly into the tool, I will show what a playbook looks like so people have an example. This is one example. So on a per clause and per issue basis, the AI knows what to look for. That's how they look. So legal research, this is the big area here. And when we talk about hallucinations, legal research is the big area that fundamentally people are tending to focus on this. So what I would recommend is absolutely use AI to get up to speed and start orienting yourself in a problem and diving in. It can be incredibly fast. We've seen people put in, large law firm publication, practice notes, pieces of advice they've received, historically legal opinions. That will then be synthesized and given back to you with a view. That then is not the end of the workflow, though. You would normally, depending on which document the AI has advised is most important, or which rule is most important, or which specific statute is most important, you'll then go and look at the subject of the statute and double check that as a final check. That's why you would then ask to show its reasoning and its primary sources. So we do this automatically where we'll say exactly where we researched. We always default to researching in your internal information. But really what you want to be able to do is get there very quickly and then be able to verify, but like never forget the verify step. I would never use AI as a substitute for actually going direct to the source. So like when the AI gives you an output and says it came from a statute, I would ask for a link to the statute and where in the statute it was, so which specific provision. I would then go and read it. Like I do not like have the AI tell you that it's in there and then completely take your hands off and be like, okay, I trust it. Make sure to double check. You see some examples of lawyers who've done that, and it introduces unacceptable levels of liability for their business. Um, Obviously, the same thing here. We have seen examples, even some of the largest players, big names that I won't mention on this call, but you'll have seen examples of lawyers sharing online where they are making mistakes. So it's worth being aware that that can happen, and it's always worth double checking. Um, we talked about the long chats, and when the context window gets full, accuracy starts to drop. So the way that people tend to do this, it's similar to what I was saying before, that step by step, but it's also you tend to do one task per chat. And when I say one task, often that's like one like contract review of a particular type. So if you receive a sales contract and you're working through it in a particular chat, you may then come back to that chat on the next turn so that you still have the context. But I wouldn't recommend taking two sales contracts you're reviewing simultaneously and doing them both in the same chat. I would have separate chats for each of them. Um, so The other thing is, obviously, we've mentioned this before, but being specific up front, you end up with a lot less back and forth. So the most effective users, once they've got a nicely refined prompt, get there more quickly. And then if you start seeing a really messy chat, and you'll see even the largest AI providers, sometimes you'll see the AI gets lost or gets in a hole. I just start a fresh chat. You can even you sometimes you can say, "Give me the key context from this chat," and you just open up a new one and go again from there. Rather than basically these enormous, really long chats, you tend to see the output will drop. So keep it on going in that one is not as good approach as to start a new chat. Um, Obviously, I think everyone on this call will be pretty well aware of how to make sure their providers are secure. But obviously, data residency. Sorry, I've got 2 points the same here, which is my mistake. But data residency is around where people are going to be hosting your data. So double check, if you're a US business or a Canadian business, you may want to be hosted in US data centers. European, we often will see wanting to be in Germany. And in our APAC customers, quite often it's Singapore. Most of the large providers and companies that are well established, like ourselves, will be able to host in those areas. So I'd always ask about it. Obviously, in your contractual protections, make sure that there's coverage around things like personal information, regulation. It's also worth checking with your AI provider. Are they complying with like things like the EU AI Act? All of those things. Do they like take responsible approaches to development of technology? And I'd say the biggest one is this data training. So make sure that they're not training on your data, because what you don't want is to put in a contract. And sometimes this is a real concern we'll see. Someone's using ChatGPT, they put it in their sales contract. And then 2 years later, when ChatGPT trains on the previous information, someone asks, "What did we agree? What was the commercial position on this between these two people?" It's trained in the data for ChatGPT. So these large consumer-facing models, they may be training on your data. So it's really worth checking that. You don't want the same thing we always do is with customers. We segregate client data completely separately. Nothing trains across them. So you'll see the AI will improve for your business, but it doesn't improve for other businesses. And it's worth checking on that. You don't want to have a unpleasant surprise down the line as a result of finding out that actually your data was being trained on. Um, so I'll pause there. Those are some of the super user tips. Don't know if we had any questions come through, Hannah, on the chat. Otherwise, we're towards the end. Last few forward-thinking thoughts, and then we'll do some questions.
Yeah, awesome. So we've actually got Kerry, who's had her hand up for a little while. I'm not sure if Lynette wants to. Oh no, Kerry doesn't have a question. That's okay. So we've actually got one here. So should we give specific or precise prompts in sort of back-to-back prompts before letting the AI respond to all of them, or should we go back and forth with the AI to receive responses to the first prompt before sort of trying the second?
Normally, I would do receive a response to the first prompt before you jump onto the second. So normally, you want to put in a prompt, allow it to come back to you, review the output of that first prompt, then step into the second prompt. So you sort of, I wouldn't fire them all at once. I would fire one, look at the response, another one, look at the response. That's how I tend to approach it.
Another one here from Laura, which is a great one, sort of topical about the research that's coming out about sort of the impact of AI and how it affects people's own logic and skills. How do you recommend users sort of deploy AI without undermining their own sort of capacity, knowledge, etc.? How can employers ensure that they're supporting their employees in developing skills and not sort
Yeah.
of reducing that skill set?
Such a great point, actually. And it's something we see a lot of our customers ask us about. We've had for some customers, we've done something quite fun where we'll set up a quiz, and you'll have for training the team, you'll say, run this through the AI and like let me know what it picks up. And if it misses something, they then like fail the quiz. So you train people to actually be double checking and then test them on the double checking. So that's how I think you maintain the for detail. A lot of what we talked about today as well, the skills of the lawyer of I think it's always been the case that as a lawyer, much of your skill is in really being focused on specific provisions, being able to think through them and understand what's around the corner. If anything, I'd say AI is actually allowing people to do more of that and focus less on identifying where the provision is. So really the mitigation of risk, the AI can give you suggestions, but judging whether or not it's a good mitigation sits with the lawyer. The where risks sit in a contract, the AI can show you where they are. It could give you a suggestion, but really we're still seeing a ton of judgment being people using their judgment on top of the AI and even learning from the AI. So one thing that's really interesting is we're sometimes seeing people use AI to upskill themselves. So they'll do research into a topic and go a lot deeper down a thread than they might have been able to given the time before. So if you find sort of like an unusual German data protection provision, people will be going through doing a whole bunch more research themselves, getting to a position and then turning to local counsel. So we're actually seeing a lot of people, I would say, upskilling, but spending more time on the pieces that matter, that judgment, that real deep dive into key points, or just understanding the business context as to like which of the options the AI gives really mitigates the risk the most effectively.
Thanks, Beth. We'll take one more for now, and then obviously everyone feel free to write some more questions to the end. But Lynette's got a great one, which is those highly specific instructions, should they be included in every prompt, or is it that they can be stored in somewhere like memories and then maybe just referenced?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And I would say over time, people store them more in memories. So, funnily enough, as you're starting out, these tips work really well and help you unblock it of a specific issue. Over time, actually, it gets easier and easier to get good outputs because the AI starts to learn, oh, I see, I know what you're doing. So, those very specific prompts of like maybe we talked a bit about like an issues list with a table. Once you've saved in the memory, if I ask for an issues list, I like a table that looks like this. Going forward, you could just ask. I'm a very fast talker. Sorry, I'm seeing some of the comments come through. If you've already specified how you like the issues list, then going forward, you can just say, "Give me an issues list," and it will know that you want a table from the memories and produce that output. So the overall specificity over time, you can get less specific. It's just still useful to know what you've got to be specific about. I think is the key thing. And then once you're set up, you tend to find it takes even less time.
Awesome, thanks, Beth.
No problem. So jumping in, I know we've got about 5 to 10 minutes left. So just the last bits. I mean, it's an interesting point is that what a lot of the researchers at the top labs are always very aware that AI today is at the least intelligent it will ever be. And what that means is a really exciting progress for everything that we'll be able to do, but also it's really worth staying close to it. So, what are the reasons that we think it's worth investing in AI schools? I mean, it's not effectively what we're seeing is that the best lawyers aren't just going to be able to know the law, they're going to be using AI very effectively to deliver more work. So, we tend to see teams can really increase their output with the same amount of time. It's automating drafting, researching, document review. And really, you sometimes you've seen some people, they're running 8 contract reviews at once and then jumping in and picking out from each one, they're sort of assisting the AI. I think that's quite exciting because you're really doing the thoughtful, interesting work for much more time and a lot less of the kind of drudgery of really reading through it all. The other piece is, of course, like for your careers, we completely understand that people are concerned about how this will impact jobs. We're actually seeing more and more job openings, particularly around innovation or for innovative lawyers, people joining legal tech companies, all sorts. But really being fluent in these tools, it sets you up for the future in your role. So I think it's really useful, and I'd always recommend that. One thing we've seen that's very interesting is where very senior members in a team adopt the tool. That's our number one marker of great adoption across a team. So we've seen some really, really forward-thinking general counsels that will say, "Wow, I've been using AI." They then pass around the team, and then the whole team adopts it really well. We also see the other way around, where really innovative lawyers then pass up to into the team and go, "By the way, I've been trying this tool. It is saving me a ton of time. Maybe we should all look at it." But what I mean there is really basically those people that are the champions, they're often getting really great exposure in their business across leadership. The last one that's really interesting, and I'll share more details down the line, is we're starting to see AI as a growing demand for fractional general counsels, outsourced lawyers who are using AI. So it's an interesting trend actually of more people are sometimes working a bit more flexible hours, a bit more across multiple businesses, potentially remotely, and they're being able to, with AI, deliver really great outputs across a range of businesses. I think it's quite an interesting new career path. We partner with some lawyers who do that. It might be an interesting thing for people on this call. If you're ever interested in that sort of fractional general counsel, flexible roles, we're always happy to talk more about it. But I think it's a cool one because basically using AI, you can start to work more flexibly, choose more of your hours. Um, so key takeaways, and this is my last slide, so you won't have to listen to me anymore. So the AI literacy basically has now become a core skill, and I would really recommend that it's worth trying it. The best results are from being deliberate. You don't have to be like a coder. You don't have to be technical. It's all natural language. Hopefully, the prompt tips I shared today are very digestible. It's, there's no rocket science here. It's really simple and intuitive, but it's worth starting because what we see is the people who've done the most of it are getting the most output already. So the earlier people started, the further along they are. The bits we mentioned here are be specific and break tasks down. Always just make a start. You can refine as you go. There's not a ton of loss involved usually in using AI. So what really happens is if you have a chat and it doesn't go how you like, you can always do another chat. If you've and so we tend to find the experience gets better and better over time. So yeah, that's what I would lead with is really don't be afraid to try out the tools, give it a go. Always, if you have any questions, but always you can connect with me on LinkedIn if you have questions. I'm always happy to take those. And you can obviously speak with any of myself, Hannah, or Matt. And thank you so much for joining. It was great to be able to share a bit more about how to use AI.
Love it, Gus. Thank you so much. Oh my God, what a wealth of information. That was wonderful. Both Gus and Hannah, really appreciate your time today.